のかの夜空を行く待ちに待った思いを胸に星の長い今夜だけは止まれ織姫に会いに行く麗しの君よ変わられて見たことない着物黄金色の髪去年まで無口だったあなたは今年は落ちるならば一年ぶり君は変わないね驚いた僕の顔を見て笑うつつましやかだったあなたはどこにいてしまわれたのでしょう
Welcome to Mangata Americana. Today we're going to be reviewing in a freeform format Venom Dark Origin by Zeb Wells. Okay, so Venom Dark Origin, let's see when it was made. It was made, I don't know, it was mid-2000s I think. No, late 2000s actually, yeah. So around 2007, 2008, something like that. And essentially, it is a Venom origin story, which we've gotten before that point. Anyone who's a longtime fan of Spider-Man would know about the old school Secret Wars story, which, you know, had Spider-Man go to Battle World and first pick up the symbiote thinking it was a costume. And then we would have the Todd McFarlane run of Spider-Man. Todd McFarlane, in case you don't know, is the same guy who created Spawn after he left Marvel and formed Image Comics, which is why there's a lot of similarities between the character of Spawn and Venom. Anywho, and so we had, you know, the Venom origin, you know, Spider-Man was out doing his thing. Oh, turns out it's actually alive. He got rid of it with the help of Mr. Fantastic, came back, went to the church, got rid of it again, later bonded to a guy named Eddie Brock, you know, and then, you know, Venom was born, essentially. But, of course, the majority of this origin story, or this version of the origin story, was from the perspective of Spider-Man. Because, again, for all he knew, it was just a costume. Later on in the origin story, we do get introduced to Eddie Brock and characters like the Sin Eater and Jane DeWolf and whatnot. But we had none of Eddie Brock's backstory, and that is what Venom Dark Origins gives us. Now, see, the story, like I said, is mostly from Eddie's perspective. It really starts out in his childhood, and there's several themes running throughout this book. A big theme is trying to fill a void in one's life. Eddie, who we learn, you know, later on in other stories, was actually from San Francisco. Now, Eddie was living with his father, Charles, and he had a sister, Mary, I believe her name was. And, of course, Eddie was always seeking attention, in particular from the opposite sex. Not that it was a sexual thing or anything like that, but because, obviously, Phyllis, or what his mother was. His mother, who he never met because she had died in childbirth. And so he always felt this feminine element missing from his life. Yes, there was his older sister. His sister looked down on Eddie and blamed him for the death of their mom. And of course, with the mother gone, the sister had to take care of all the household chores and whatnot. And so she kind of viewed Eddie as being a burden, and Eddie felt as much. Now, he was always trying to get attention and approval from his father, Charles, but Charles was always dismissive. He wasn't abusive towards Eddie, but he did blame Eddie for the loss of his wife, even though he would tell Eddie and his sister that, no, it's not Eddie's fault, your mom died during childbirth. But Eddie had learned very early on to tell when people were lying. Matter of fact, Charles in this story, you know, when him and Eddie were watching the news, you could tell when the guy was lying. And so Charles told him, hey, you should report the news, which planted the first seed of Eddie becoming a journalist later on. And of course, you know, Eddie thought this was a cool skill he had. Of course, his father was always dismissive. Earlier in the story, actually, at the start of the story, there's a neighborhood cat that goes missing. Eddie ends up finding it for the little girl. And of course, you know, oh, you know, I got this attention, I got this approval. Well, Eddie didn't tell the other kids that he's the one that actually took the cat and hid it so that he could set himself up as a hero. And while that is kind of scummy, because it's not, it doesn't come from an inherently evil place, because again, Eddie just wants that validation. He wants that attention that, for one, he wasn't getting it from his mother because she was gone, and he wasn't getting it from his father or his sister either. And so he would set up these scenarios all throughout the story to present himself as the hero, in particular to women. And so later on, after he deals with his father, he's going to church, and, he's a very deep Catholic. And he reminisces about how, they're talking about the Virgin Mother Mary. And he tells this lady that, is she really my mother? And the lady says, yeah, she's, your mother after a fashion. And he says he killed his mother, which, isn't inherently true, but at the same time, he is responsible for her death via childbirth. Of course, the nice lady reassures him that, it wasn't his fault. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. But there's still that sense of guilt that was instilled from him by his father and sister. And so he always blames himself for his mother's death. And so, later on, he's in middle school, early high school, whatever. And he's trying to impress this girl, saying that, he just got on the wrestling team. He's wearing the jacket and whatnot. She kind of sees him as being a creep. Turns out he actually just manages the equipment. So the kids are bullying him, beating him up. And he's saying in class about journalism, or maybe it's a history class to talk about the First Amendment and whatnot, because this is around the same time that the whole Watergate scandal happened with Richard Nixon. And so the teachers tell him about, how the paper and the free press is one of the most powerful forces in the world, because two journalists essentially took down the president. Because a journalist decides what the truth is. They decide what the facts are. And, Eddie, who has consistently tried to get approval through manipulation and deception, sees this as his opportunity, as his way in, because, hey, if I become a journalist, I can tell other people what the truth is. It doesn't matter what the facts are. I tell them what it is. So the story, if it's my story, that's the way it goes. And who's to deny me? Who's to tell me what the truth is? Because I'm the one selling it. I'm the one reporting. Of course, it later fast forwards to where he's in college, and he actually gets accepted into Empire State University. Of course, there's a few discrepancies with his application because he's putting down false information. The dean kind of ignores it, it's just this kind of stuff happens all the time. It's probably just a clerical error. And of course, he ends up hooking up with this chick, tries to walk her home. He's lying the entire time, basically kind of being a creep. But again, it's not from a place of maliciousness. It's him just wanting to get that validation from a member of the opposite sex, him wanting to fill that void in his life that has been existing since he was born, again, due to the death of his mother and the being disregarded from it by his father and his sister. And of course, these guys show up, they beat the chick up, they beat up Eddie. Oh, here comes our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man to save the day. Beats him up, tells Eddie, hey, you should probably get out of here or whatever. He swings off. The chick kind of comes to. And she's like, oh my God, Eddie, how'd you beat those guys up? He goes, oh, it was easy. He's already taking credit for something Spider-Man did, when in which case he was actually about to just abandon the chick outright. But again, going back to that validation that he was having, he needed that approval. Of course, later on, he gets out of college, and this is around the time that a serial killer known as the Sin Eater first pops up. Now, the Sin Eater, I can't remember what the guy's actual name is off the bat, but it would later turn out in the old Spider-Man stories that this was the partner of Jane DeWolf, who had become, at that time, Spider-Man's ally within the police force, which he hadn't had one since George Stacy died. George Stacy was the captain of the police force. And so Jane was kind of his inside man, to where the cops weren't giving Spider-Man too much hassle. They weren't hounding him, calling him a criminal, trying to arrest him all the time. And so having this ally kind of worked for him. Well, the Sin Eater shows up and starts killing all these people for some, psychotic, delusional reasons. He ends up showing up to Jane's apartment, of course, not as the Sin Eater. Then he puts on the mask, shoots her because, hey, it's her partner. She didn't realize who it was. And of course, Eddie Brock is working at the Daily Globe at the time. And this is really where we start to tie back into the old Spider-Man stories. Of course, it is from purely Eddie's perspective. And of course, he's going in there acting like some kind of big shot or whatever. He tells his wife, and of course, he's married at the time. And if you don't know, it's the same woman from the Venom film, which they actually alluded to this in the film. They're out to dinner. She's talking about, that incident back in New York. They didn't really go into great detail because the whole agreement between Sony and Marvel in regards to Spider-Man characters was still kind of murky at the time. So she couldn't say, like, hey, Spider-Man busted the real guy. They kind of just alluded to it. But anyways, he's telling his wife, I'll get a front page story, don't worry, making her believe that he's a legitimate reporter, that he's a journalist. When in reality, he's just an intern there. He's just some dude, bringing papers and making people their coffee and writing out some schedules. He's not doing anything. He's really just a scrub. Now, this one guy, he's like, hey, go through this stuff or whatever. I got better things to do. He opens up this letter, and it's actually from the Sin Eater. He's talking about how, I killed Jane DeWolf. I'll call this one payphone this one time. Of course, Eddie goes to pick up the payphone at the designated time. And he's like, is this so-and-so? Eddie's like, no, he's off on medical leave, but, I can take the call for you. He's like, well, I got a story to tell you, and the voices in my head are telling me to kill these people. They have to die. I have to eat their sins. Of course, Eddie agrees to interview this guy, and he starts going on and starts reporting these conversations he's having, and it's making front page news. At the same time, however, the Sin Eater is being shown on photos by Peter Parker because Spider-Man's trying to stop this guy this time, and he just can't. Somehow this dude is always getting away from Spider-Man. And of course, things are going well for Eddie. He's making a lot of money. He's a full-time journalist. His wife's happy. He's the big shot. He's, making all this money. And the Sin Eater, this is through telephone. He hasn't actually seen this guy yet. And at the time in the original Spider-Man stories, we don't know who he is. We don't know he's actually Jane DeWolf's partner. So this guy, the Sin Eater, tells Eddie he wants to meet him at Our Lady of Saints Church, which is a Catholic church in New York City. And, he's kind of sitting behind or whatever. He's telling, I got to do these things, the voices in my head, I got to eat people's sins because I'm the Sin Eater or whatever. I'm on this important mission. I need you to tell my story. And of course, it's around the same time that Eddie notices something on the Virgin Mary statue, something black, something, liquidy, something fluidity. And of course, this is around the same time that this is the second time Spider-Man had actually gotten rid of the black suit. In the old Spider-Man stories, first it was Mr. Fantastic, but then it escaped from the Baxter building, disguised itself as a red and blue Spider-Man suit, snuck into his closet, and then when he put it on, it revealed itself. And of course, the Fantastic Four are out of town at that point, so he goes to this church, which is the closest place nearby, has a giant bell, uses Sonics to get it off, and Spider-Man thinks that the thing died, that it just, broke down and dissolved or whatever, which the ironic part is that because it had bonded to his nervous system, the bells are hurting Peter as well, and it knocked him out. And so the symbiote, despite what Peter was doing to it, still cared about him. And so it actually drug him to safety before seemingly crawling off to die. Of course, Eddie doesn't know any of this. He thinks, he's just hallucinating. That black stuff on the statue, it's there, then it goes away. Well, you see a shot in the book where, Eddie's facing forward because the Sin Eater's in there. He doesn't want, hey, don't see my face. We're just here to talk. And you see behind the Sin Eater's actually the black suit. It's creeping around there. It's very thematic because you have all these delusions. You have, these nonsensical things going on. You have this talk about sin within a Catholic church and whatnot. Of course, Eddie's reflecting on his own sin subconsciously. And of course, the symbiote is also there, like I said. And so you have a lot of thematic elements going on at this point in the story. Well, he tells Eddie his real name is Emil Gregg. And so Eddie's like, yeah, I got the story, I got the scoop. And of course, Eddie walks out, he sees the cop, reading a paper, by him or whatever. So he's feeling good about himself. He's the big shot. The Daily Bugle isn't getting the big scoop. J. Jonah Jameson, who I don't think he owned the Bugle at the time, but he wasn't the editor-in-chief. He was still the publisher. He stopped being the editor-in-chief because the Hobgoblin was going to expose him or whatnot, because he created the Scorpion. But he still played a big part, but he's pissed off because the Bugle isn't selling well. And so, Jameson's like, hey, Brock's, he's doing the big thing. The cops show up. It's like, hey, we want to talk to you. We think you know who this guy is. You're protecting a serial killer. And he's like, I got nothing to say with you. I just have a source. They end up arresting him. Of course, he ends up getting released. His attorney's like, yeah, this arrest was unconstitutional. It wasn't necessary. Mr. Brock, being a representative of the press, he has freedom of press. He has freedom of speech or whatever. And he's just protecting his source. Of course, Eddie tries to shamelessly promote his new article or whatever. They get in a car together, and the attorney's like, look, man, if you know who this guy is, you could be in some serious trouble. He's like, you could actually go to jail if it turns out that's the case. He's like, oh, jail will be fine. Gives me time to write my book. Ha. Well, he goes back to his apartment, and his dad shows up. He's like, Eddie, I can tell when you're lying. You know exactly who this guy is. No, I don't know who it is. I'm just protecting my source, kind of like Watergate. He goes, no, that's a bunch of bull, Eddie. You are protecting a murderer. You're not protecting a damn witness. He's like, no, this story's important to me. He's like, Eddie, you're not protecting the little people anymore. You're stepping on them. You think that this guy's story is more important than his victims. The people that he's killing are more important, Eddie. At least that's how I see it. You turned your back on everybody. I am ashamed of you. And of course, and that's a big blow to Eddie, because his entire life, aside from trying to fill this hole that he had, emotionally, was trying to get his father's approval, and he was never going to get it. Now, once he's a big shot, he thinks he's somebody. Oh, my dad will be impressed. Well, it turns his dad's just ashamed of him because he did it the wrong way, which is really an ugly thing, because, yeah, Eddie was going about it the wrong way, but at the same time, growing up, his dad never gave in. His dad never gave him any kind of approval. And so, he was so desperate to get that from his father. He was willing to do anything, which unfortunately is a theme we see a lot throughout the story. Not just that, but in real life as well. You see parents, sometimes with the mother, but more so than the mother, it's usually the father. Whether it's from some kind of outdated ideology or something they went through as a child, so they thought it was okay, not ever giving their child, specifically a son or a daughter a lot of the times, approval, to where these kids end up doing very stupid things when they get older, just for that attention, just for that sense of, hey, I accept you, I love you, I'm proud of you. And Charles was just never going to give that to Eddie, because he unjustly blamed Eddie for his wife's death, which it really wasn't Eddie's fault. Yeah, it was because of the childbirth, but Eddie didn't choose to kill his mother. That had nothing to do with him. It was just a medical incident. But anyways, so Eddie's back at the Daily Globe. He's a big hotshot. The boss wants to talk to him, and the boss got some bad news. Turns out the guy who he was interviewing, because he was pressured into releasing the guy's real name, which he did, and this guy was arrested because he was sneaking into J. Jonah Jameson's office to assassinate him. Well, Jameson wasn't there. Jameson was actually in Florida at the time. And another guy tried to assassinate him there. And Spider-Man busted that guy. Well, it turns out that was the real Sin Eater. The guy that Eddie had been interviewing was a copycat. Matter of fact, he really hadn't killed anybody, and Jameson was going to be his actual first victim. And so he was essentially interviewing a serial confessor, not a serial killer. And so basically all these papers, all these articles that Eddie had written and that Day Globe had published, they're garbage. So it hurt the paper very badly. And so his boss is like, look, man, this looks bad. This is really bad, and I'm not taking the fall for it. This paper's not taking the fall for it. You, my friend, are taking the fall for it. Pack your stuff and get out. So he lost his job. He lost the respect of his peers. And he's just down in the dumps. He's depressed. Later on, turns out that not just his depression, but just the financial ruin and just everything else, his wife left him. She divorced. She cut out. She says, I'm not doing this anymore. You're just a bum. You are just a liar, a phony, which again is something, this isn't new to Eddie. He has always been a phony. He has always lied to get people's approval. The only difference is that here he genuinely believed he was interviewing the killer. And he really only told people his identity because he was pressured into doing it. He cared more about getting that approval and making this big story more so than the people that were actually being killed. But he wasn't even interviewing the real killer. And so even if he was like halfway in the right and he was halfway being honest, it turns out it was all a bunch of BS anyways. And so he's really down the dumps now. His wife's filed for divorce. She's left. She's living somewhere else. Well, she's leaving a recording on his voicemail. This is back whenever we had phones attached to the house and not everything was cellular. And so, which is just, a sign of the times, really. But he picks up a gun and he's going back to Our Lady of Saints Church, which is appropriate because two reasons. One, that's where he was interviewing the fake killer. And so, hey, you might as well just, come full circle with it. Plus, Eddie Brock was a very deep Catholic. And so he was going to confess his upcoming suicide to God. Now, another part, you don't see this in this story in particular, but in the old Spider-Man tales, he was, on top of everything else he was dealing with, Eddie had also recently been diagnosed with adrenal cancer. He was going to die. And so he lost his job, lost all his money, lost his reputation, lost any respect he had, from his peers and for himself, lost his wife. Oh, and he's going to die on top of it. So, and he just, what's the point? What's the point of keep going on anymore? At least that's how he saw it in his mind. And he's confessing this, his upcoming suicide to God. And he's looking at the Virgin Mary statue. He says, I know you're there, God. At least I think I know. I know you don't approve of what I'm about to do, so I thought I'd let you see what I've become. Trying to get forgiveness, preemptively. What Spider-Man's done to me. So it's for the best. There's a blackness there. I can feel it like it's real. They call him a hero, but he destroyed my life. Now, this is very important because in his mind, he worked so hard to get this reputation and success. And if Spider-Man had just butt out and not busted the real Sin Eater, because again, Eddie was interviewing a copycat, a fake serial killer, then none of this would have happened. He'd been just fine. He'd been good. And so it's Spider-Man's fault. And in a way it is, because again, if he didn't arrest the real serial killer, Eddie would have been fine. But it wasn't like Spider-Man knew. He was just trying to do the right thing. He was trying to avenge his friend, Jane DeWolf. He was trying to stop all kinds of innocent people from being killed. He was trying to stop a madman, a psychopath. He had no idea really who Eddie Brock was, by and large. I mean, if you told him, hey, that guy Eddie Brock, he goes, oh yeah, that's a reporter for the Globe, isn't it? But, it's not like he knew the guy personally. But in Eddie's mind, while there is some truth to it, the more he dwells on it, the more and more he builds this conspiracy in his head. Like, oh, Spider-Man plotted the whole thing. Spider-Man somehow knew that he was ruining my life. And he's talking about how there's this blackness, and he's talking about within his soul, within himself, within his psyche. But at the same time, the symbiote was in that church, and it was leaking out of the statue. It's coming out as a tear from the statue. Meanwhile, while Eddie Brock is crying, he's crying out of anger, out of frustration, out of depression. His life is over in every way you can really conceive. And he says, there's no forgiveness in my heart for him. I know I need to kill myself. It's what I deserve, which is the first time he's really admitting that he's at fault for anything. However, he views Spider-Man as the bigger villain. But all I can think about is killing him. Because again, Eddie blames Spider-Man for his problems now. And this is when the symbiote emerges and attacks Eddie, and it bonds with him. It's crawling inside of his body. There's a priest there, and he's like, hey, man, you need to keep it down. But then he sees what's going on. He's like, oh, my God. Like, what's this nonsense? And the symbiote bonding to Eddie Brock, it's showing him the event known as Secret Wars, which took place on Battle World. You had the Beyonder testing the concept of desire between heroes and villains. Shows all these guys fighting. And it's showing, how Spider-Man found it thinking it was just a costume. And it shows Spider-Man ripping it off himself at that church. And so Eddie and the symbiote start to bond, not just physically, but mentally as well. It says, tried to kill us. Spider-Man tried to kill us. Because, again, Eddie is blaming Spider-Man for all of his problems. And at the same time, the symbiote, he literally tried to kill it. Granted, Peter just viewed it as like this evil parasite that was trying to take over his body and his mind. He didn't realize that it was also this complex organism emotionally and psychologically. He just didn't really know the full. He just knew that it was alive. It was trying to bond with him. That's about it. Because by and large, people on Earth had never really experienced anything like that. And so it viewed Spider-Man as like, hey, you're supposed to be my buddy. You're supposed to be my friend. I'm trying to help you. I'm giving you all this extra power. We're supposed to be, two peas in a pod. And you try to kill me. After everything I tried to do for you, you tried to kill me. And so now Eddie and the symbiote are aligned, not just physically, but in their goals as well. Tried to kill both of us. These cops show up or whatever. Oh, he must be on drugs or whatever. All right, man, you got to go. Get out of here. But that's when the symbiote fully emerges from his body and forms a costume. And, he's looking like this dark, angelic figure. And, of course, he attacks the cops. They're trying to shoot him. The bullets are being stopped by the symbiote. Eddie's like, oh, okay, cool. He's just destroying these guys. He just wraps one up, throws him through some stuff, busts out of the church. The priest is, chanting his stuff, Father, Son, Holy Ghost, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. And Eddie, wrapped up in the symbiote says, he really just looks like a big black Spider-Man right now. He hasn't formed the full Venom visage. They say I'm guilty, Father, and I was just trying to please them. Then he's talking about the general public, because once he was exposed, the public turned on him, his job turned on him, everybody turned against him. But he was just trying to make people happy. He was trying to please them. He tried to give them what they want, tell them what they wanted to hear, so that he could have their acceptance. He says, I want you to forgive me, because again, Brock is a Catholic. He's like, for what? For the lies I had to tell, for the lies they made me tell. Now, these people didn't force him to tell these lies, obviously, but in Eddie's mind, this was the only way he could get people's approval, the only way he could get attention, the only way he could get validation and love was to just lie his ass off. Because, up until that point, that's all that worked. Him just trying to be a good guy didn't cut it. He's asking for forgiveness, and he sees the dead cop that's hanging behind him. He goes, oh, and for that too, probably. Of course, this other cop tries to run him over. He throws the car into the church. He's like, oh, that's the last one. I promise. He makes this big smile with the symbiote. The priest says, you're forgiving. Go in peace, my child. He's freaking out. He's got PTSD now. He's like, oh, thank you, Father. I'll do that. The symbiote changes back into his regular clothes because it has these shape-shifting abilities. And then, he sees that Anne and her lawyer are waiting at his apartment. He goes, oh, man, I can't let her see me like this. I look like a homeless guy. Well, the symbiote turns into a blade, cuts him, shaves him right. He's like, yeah, I can hear you. You're right. I don't need her anymore, because the symbiote is already doing what it was trying to do with Spider-Man, be it subconsciously, it's like, hey, you don't need anybody else. We just need each other. And we would learn in later stories, in particularly Donny Cates' run of Venom, that this was because the Venom symbiote, it does need a bond to a host to survive physically, but it's also an emotional need. It doesn't want to be alone. It's like, hey, you don't need anybody else. You just need me. Like, don't leave me. Don't abandon me, which is why it was so hurt by Spider-Man. Yeah, the bells and the sonics, that hurt it physically, but it was the emotional pain it felt by being betrayed by someone it truly loved, not in a romantic or in a sexual sense, but as in like, hey, we're supposed to be, bonded, we're supposed to be one and the same, and you hurt me like that. Anyone who's gone through any kind of abuse, be it from a spouse or from a parent, knows that feeling. It's, this person, I love this person more than anything, and they're hurting me. What did I do wrong? And that's how the symbiote feels. And so it's telling Eddie, he's like, yeah, you don't need her anymore anyways. You got me. We got each other. We're two peas in a pod, man. And so, he shows up. She's like, oh my God, Eddie, like, you got this nice new suit. You spent a lot of money. He goes, oh, it's no big deal. The lawyer says, you signed this divorce paperwork. He says, you got a pen? He goes, yeah, I got a pen. He just manifests one with the symbiote. He says, it has to be black ink. It's black ink, right? He goes, oh, don't worry. I wouldn't worry about that. Obviously, because the symbiote itself is black. And of course, Anne says, well, it's good to see you finally taking some responsibility. He's like, what? He goes, well, last time we talked, you kept making excuses, couldn't stop talking about Spider-Man. He's like, Spider-Man ruined our lives. And his now ex-wife, Anne, she's like, how, Eddie? He's just some guy in a costume. He doesn't know you from Adam. And you have no idea who he is. It's like, but I gotta go. Of course, he bolts out of there. He's done. He goes, no clue who he is. But that's not true, is it? Because and he looks in the mirror. He's, of course, talking to the symbiote. Of course, the symbiote, being bonded to Spider-Man, knows who he is. Of course, Eddie just starts laughing and laughing. He's like, ha, I got the information now. I got the scoop. Oh, look how clever I am as a journalist. And that's when the big Venom mouth that most people are familiar with starts forming. Like, he gets this big maul, this big long tongue, these teeth. He becomes very malicious because Spider-Man ruined my life. Spider-Man ruined your life too. And we know who he is. And we're together. And we have the power to take him down. And of course, he's got this apartment. He's stewing. He's just sitting there thinking. And of course, Eddie's just thinking about through his life and how nothing he does works. And that's when the symbiote more or less shows it a bit of a history, not of, necessarily itself, but of its species and basically what they do. And of course, it's giving Eddie all these flashbacks to, this one alien world. These things were dying. Various symbiotes were bonding to him. He's like, okay, yeah, so this is what you do. You take things that can't survive on their own, you bond with them and make them stronger, and you both benefit. He goes, well, yeah, my answer is yes. Please take me. And it fully starts bonding with him. And of course, Eddie's creeping around at this point. He's in disguise. He goes to this train station, and Peter Parker's there, sitting there, or he's standing there, right? He's like, well, this picture of Spider-Man, I took that picture. And some guy's like, yeah, man, I don't really care. Go about your business. Well, Eddie pushes Peter, again, in disguise. He's got like this hat on, this coat, manifested by the symbiote, of course. And he pushed him in front of a train. Now, this train comes, and Peter's spider sense and his reflexes kick in. He's like, oh my God, what happened? And this guy says, hey, you know who pushed that guy in front of the train? Eddie, again, changes his disguise. He's like, oh, the guy ran off that way. And Eddie just walks away, and he's reminiscing to himself. He's like, that was easy, because he's got this spider sense, which helped him get away from that train, but he couldn't detect us coming up on him. He didn't know that we were going to push him, because being bonded with him, how he works. About his spider sense. How to block it out. So he will never see us coming. And so he knows that, Peter can't find him, and Peter cannot find Venom until Venom wants to be found. And so, Mary Jane's at home. This is Peter's. I want to say I don't think they're married at this point. I think they're They just got back together because Peter and MJ had broken up. He had this on-again, off-again thing with Black Cat, which is why around that time, Peter was still wearing a black costume, because even though he got rid of the symbiote, after, the breakup with Mary Jane, he got back with the Black Cat, Felicia Hardy, and she says, "Oh, that black cat foot looks so sexy on you." And she made him an artificial one made of just like traditional cloth and whatnot. And so he was swinging around with that. He's just basically getting laid. That's all that was. Of course, Mary Jane's like, "Oh my God," she sees this black costume, which again, Peter was wearing at the time, hanging over, the window. He's like, "Oh, it's just a costume." But then it starts smiling. It's not a costume. It is the symbiote, knowing where he lives, of course. And it manifests, and, Eddie's crawling around. He's psychologically torturing her. He's like, "Yeah, you'll never be as good as me." He's not saying, "Hey, I'm this crazy, washed-up journalist bonded to an alien parasite." No, he is pretending to be the black suit, the costume, taken on a life of its own. Because at this point, Mary Jane knows what the symbiote is. She knows, oh, it was that first black suit was just this evil alien or whatever. And he's like, but of course, not only is he pretending to just be the symbiote, but he's pretending to be the identity of Spider-Man itself, psychologically torturing her, because he's telling her, like, "Hey, he loves me more than you. At the end of the day, to where if you asked him to stop being Spider-Man, he would choose Spider-Man over you. I am more important." Of course, he's kind of like swinging her around or whatever, hanging her up. He's like, "They say he's a hero. He's not. He's a fraud. Yeah, sure, I made some mistakes." And of course, he's speaking from the point of Eddie Brock, but he's a bigger liar than I am, and he gets to have everything he wants. I lost everything. How's that fair? And of course, he just throws her against the wall. He's like, "Tell him I'm going to kill him. This time, I am not lying." Of course, now Eddie's made his move against Mary Jane. He's kind of creeping around. He's studying Spider-Man. Of course, her being a journalist is that he does photography work as well. So he's cleaning these walls, taking pictures. He's studying them, basically. He drops down, and there's just, this bodyguard hanging out by his car, thinking that Eddie's creeping on his client. He's like, he's trying to rough Eddie up, but then he transforms into the symbiote and, covers his body. He throws him in this car, basically kills him. And of course, in his mind, he's like, "Oh yeah, we shouldn't kill innocent people, but he might have exposed us to Spider-Man, and Spider-Man is the real bad guy, so it was a necessary evil. He just had to die, casualties of war. We sacrificed this guy's life to cover ourselves up, to defeat the greater evil." And of course, he's back at his apartment. He's working out. He's bench pressing. He's just getting jacked. He's full of muscles. And he's telling the symbiote, he's like, "No, we got to keep working out, because the more muscle I build, that's more muscle mass for you to work with." And that's really why Eddie Brock with the Venom symbiote was stronger than Spider-Man. Spider-Man has his powers because of his mutation. He got bit by a radioactive spider, mutated his genes, and so it's biochemistry. He really doesn't have, he's muscular and he's ripped, but he doesn't look like, Hulk Hogan back in the day. He doesn't look like old school Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's certainly no Lou Ferrigno. But the symbiote doesn't work like that. It takes the muscle mass of its host and multiplies that strength. And that's why Eddie, who is just a normal human being, is so much stronger than Spider-Man when he has the symbiote. Even in instances where Spider-Man has the symbiote, Eddie Brock is still stronger than him, which is why if you've ever played the game Spider-Man Web of Shadows, you see that. Because, again, it's not a matter of biochemistry. The symbiote just has more physical mass to work with in regards to Eddie Brock. And that's what he's trying to explain to the symbiote. And so, he's creeping, Spider-Man moved because, MJ was assaulted, it scared her, gave her PTSD, whatnot. And he's moving into his new apartment. You see Mary Jane's got this new lamp. There's Flash Thompson. There's Robbie Robertson from the Bugle. They're all having a good time. And he says, "There he is. Peter Parker, your previous owner. You see what he rejected you for. See why you were tossed aside. He's talking to the symbiote, of course. That should be us in our penthouse apartment. He's got our life. It's time to pull the rug out from under his perfect little world. And again, this goes back to the idea that, Spider-Man just took their life from them. Like, oh, he gets all the rewards, even though he's kind of a phony. That should be us. And so Eddie is feeding into his own delusions. Again, going back to the whole, it's a conspiracy, even though no, it's not. It really isn't. And so he's like peeking through the window, and Spider-Man sees him, and he's sitting there smiling, and he gets angry. He says, "Ooh, he looks angry." So they bolt off, and of course they're swinging around, and he's like, "No, slow down. We want him to catch up." Of course, Spider-Man does, and they end up fighting. He throws him through a building. They're fighting back and forth. He says, when you tossed off your living costume you forgot that it had been one with you. It knows your mind, knows your every trick. So, not all of them. He tries to just randomly throw himself at this dude. He goes, really? He just punches him like, dude, like, you're not slick. I'm like twice your size, and you're coming straight at me. Now your refuse is my other, and you'll pay for obliterating everything I lived for. He's like, who are you? Of course, he slings around. He goes, I'm the fruit of your heroic actions. You are the spider, and I am your venom come back to sting you. I'm the innocent you ruined. Again, he says he's innocent, and he kind of was, but again, at the same time, Eddie Brock was a phony. He was a fake. He'd been lying his entire life. Even in the one time where he was trying to tell the truth, and he thought he was being legit, the whole thing was just a bunch of BS anyways. And of course, as I said, I'm your venom come back to sting you. That's how we get the name Venom. Because Eddie Brock and the symbiote have viewed themselves as a living incarnation of what we know as karma. What goes around comes around. But in the grander scheme, because again, Eddie and the symbiote viewed Spider-Man as the bad guy. But in the grander scheme of things, it can be looked at as no good deed goes unpunished. Peter found out that his costume was a parasite trying to take over his body, got rid of it because it was affecting his mood. He didn't know why, and it wasn't the symbiote like trying to turn him evil or whatever. It was just a chemical reaction that was because it was still bonding with him. It was throwing off the chemistry in his brain, which anyone who struggles with any kind of clinical mental health illness like bipolar disorder, depression, knows what that's like. And so it wasn't like Venom was being malicious. It was just, again, a chemical reaction that was going on. And of course, he stopped the Sin Eater, had this guy arrested because, again, the guy was a serial killer. He was hurting innocent people. And, hey, Spider-Man, he's a hero. He's got to stop this guy. And so he was doing what he thought was the right thing because in reality it was. But again, no good deed goes unpunished. And so this is why, despite his best efforts, he's being beat up right now. Him catching the real killer cost Eddie Brock his job, whatever. He got rid of the symbiote. It was pissed off. And so, as they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And so, even though, again, Spider-Man wasn't trying to hurt anybody, he ended up creating one of his greatest enemies. And Spider-Man says, that's a great story, but I still don't know who. He's like, does this help? Eddie reveals his face. He's like, Eddie Brock, Sin Eater hoax, Eddie Brock? He's like, it wasn't a hoax. It was you. You ruined my story. I'm going to kill you for it. He goes, Eddie, don't know how you got that costume, but man, it's alive. You got to get rid of it. He goes, don't talk about it like it's not here. You owe it more than that. You owe us both more. I was important. I was a reporter, and people looked up to me. He says, Eddie, come on. You publish interviews with a fake serial killer. Half the police force chased your dead lead while the real Sin Eater was free to rampage. He says, shut up. You lie about being Spider-Man and make money selling photos of yourself. You tell me, what's the difference between me and you? You tell me why you get to be a hero and we get thrown out like scum. He goes, why don't I get to come home to your sweet Mary Jane? Oh, wait, I guess I didn't I? Going back to where, he scared the daylights out of her. He's like, don't you say her name. He's like, what is? And he's like, what's that? Because he points this thing under his chin. It's for putting your hands on my girl, you slimy. And he pulled it. It's a sonic disruptor he got from the Fantastic Four. Just in case the symbiote ever came back. He goes, all right, that's cool, man. You just lie there. I'm going to go get Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic. He's like, I can't feel my muscles, but my body's moving. It seems to be reaching with longing. And that's an important note because you see Eddie Brock's hands, being directed by the symbiote, reaching out for Spider-Man, but longingly. Not like, oh, I'm trying to get you, I'm trying to kill you, but it's like physically saying, don't leave me again. It seems to be reaching with longing, with no. Hand flinches into a fist like it's been caught in the act. Like, oh, hey, the symbiote feels like, oh my God, Eddie knows what I was thinking. Or no, I'm going to clench. I'm just trying to get him. Covering up the fact that it still cares about Spider-Man. It wanted Spider-Man to come back. Even though they were fighting and becoming violent with each other, there was still love there. I mean, if not, Spider-Man did not love the symbiote whatsoever. But the symbiote, even though it had essentially been quote-unquote broken up with, it still cared about that person, which is something you see all the time in real life. You get these people that get into a relationship, one of them gets super attached. Oftentimes when it's your first relationship, we've all been there. And, the person's like, oh, well, I just don't care about you, even though, you are giving 110%. And so even after they've left you and they're off doing their own thing, and hell, you're not even an afterthought to them, you still feel that strong attachment. Again, usually with your first relationship, you usually tend to work through things better once you've been, through a few different scenarios when you get older and stuff like that. But that first heartbreak's probably the worst. And this was really the first time the Venom symbiote had felt that. We learn later on in newer stories that Peter actually wasn't its first host, but this is the first one that was like real serious. It was, hey, we aren't just hanging out or whatever, we're together. And so it was heartbroken. It didn't want to leave him. And of course, it shoots out a web line, catches Peter's ankle, swings him back. They beat him up, and they tie him up underneath this bell. And it says later, no, I don't think this was excessive. Yes, I know the webbing is made out of your substance, but see, it's almost finished. We will not have to waste any more of ourselves on this monster. Again, demonizing Spider-Man, villainizing Spider-Man. Spider-Man's the bad guy, not us. We didn't do anything wrong. We were just, trying to do the right thing, and he screwed up everything. Spider-Man's like, why are you doing this? Because this is where you tried to kill my other. Of course, this is the same bell at that church. This is where you almost killed me because Eddie had actually come there to commit suicide. Of course, blaming Spider-Man for it. Almost caused me to take my own life after you destroyed my career. Spider-Man says, how in a million years did you convince yourself that this is all my fault? Because it was easy. I just wanted to be the guy that broke the case. It wasn't my fault my source was lying. If you'd stay out of everything, it would have been fine. That does sound easy. Easier. He's like, what? He goes, well, it's a lot harder to just admit you're a screw-up. He goes, so Eddie gets pissed off. He's like, oh, you should thank me for this. You should thank me that you won't live to see your life destroyed by somebody else because of one little mistake. He's like, no, you don't get it, Brock. I've been there. I didn't stop a criminal once because I was lazy. And that man came back and ruined my life. Of course, talking about, the one guy he let get away because, it's not my problem. I'm just here to make money. I'm not a cop. Well, that guy came home and shot his Uncle Ben. So Peter does understand, and again, unlike Eddie, he wasn't trying to get approval. He wasn't trying to get praise. He just didn't give a damn. He's like, I did my show. I've got my money. I don't care. Not my problem. So in a way, Peter's mistake was a lot worse than Eddie's because he was being lazy and selfish. He just didn't care about anybody else. He goes, then you know why I have to kill you. Of course, Spider-Man's like, I didn't blame him, Eddie. I blamed the person who had screwed up my life. I blamed myself. And of course, you think you can, and it wasn't easy. And of course, Spider-Man breaks out, rings the bell, screws up the symbiote. You want to know why I'm better than you, Eddie? Of course, he's being kind of egotistical now, but it's to prove a point. Spider-Man tells him, that was my costume. And he's like, shut up, I don't want to hear it. He keeps punching him back and forth. I brought it here. I rejected it. It's my fault you found it. Which, again, Spider-Man cannot be held responsible for Eddie's actions, or the symbiotes for that matter. They're both sentient beings and therefore have free will. But at the same time, Spider-Man is correct. He did bring it back from Battle World. Granted, he didn't know what it was at the time. Whenever he took it to the bell tower, he thought it was dead. And again, he didn't know he was ruining Eddie Brock's life when he exposed the real serial killer. He was just doing his job as a hero. But Spider-Man has come to the realization that even though he was doing the right thing and he really wasn't doing anything morally wrong, his good intentions did lead to this. However, he just didn't want it to happen. It's just the way it played out. That's life. He goes, being a hero is all about taking responsibility, and I am going to take responsibility for what you've become. Again, Eddie and the symbiote are responsible for their own actions, but again, Spider-Man is going back to the fact that, yes, they make their own choices, and yes, I morally did nothing wrong and was trying to do the right thing, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. As they say, all roads lead to Rome. Whether or not I meant anything by what I was doing, that it hurt Eddie, that it hurt the symbiote, in the end, I'm the reason this suit, this symbiote, this alien is here at all. Starting now, he punches Eddie off the bell tower. Eddie's trying to shoot out a zip or web line or whatever, trying to get back up there. Of course, Spider-Man keeps cutting the web lines as they shoot up. He goes, no, Eddie, it's not going to be that easy. Try to shoot another one. You're going to learn the lesson the hard way. Of course, he keeps shooting web lines, but it's not actually him shooting it. It's the symbiote doing it against his will. Eddie says, no, we can't keep this up. We're losing ourselves. That's because when the symbiote produces webbing, unlike Spider-Man, which, he uses web cartridges, it's converting its own biomass into webbing. Basically kind of like how stem cells work. It bonded to Spider-Man and knew how to produce webbing because, hey, it's got his memories. He uses webbing. We'll convert some of myself into webbing. Cool. Everything's... And actually, Venom's webbing, because it's converted from symbiote biomass, it's slightly structurally different. It's a lot stronger. But again, they had used a whole bunch of that webbing up whenever they tied Spider-Man up to the bell tower's bell. Like, they just plastered him on there. And so it's already worn out. He says, you're done, Eddie. He keeps cutting the web lines, and every time the symbiote shoots out more webs, despite Eddie's protests, it's converting more biomass. It's losing itself. It's becoming weaker, which makes Eddie weaker too, because, yeah, Eddie has bulked up. Eddie's been lifting weights. He's this big, strong dude. But without the symbiote, he's just a dude at the end of the day. He's just a human being. He's like, you're not going anywhere. Not for a while. Of course, you see Eddie practically naked, just hanging on by a web line and what little is left of the symbiote's biomass. And of course, he gets the Fantastic Four because they're back in town. They get Eddie, they lock him up in the Baxter building, which is their headquarters, and you see, we are imprisoned. Waves of sound crash over us, keeping my other too weak to free us. It's not enough to destroy the symbiote, but just to keep it weak, because it's still bonded to Eddie. If, they use some kind of sonic device that was strong enough to kill the symbiote, it could very well kill Eddie, because Venom bonds to the nervous system. It's not like, just, a shirt or a pair of pants that you're wearing that you can just take off. It's part and parcel to him for the most part. I mean, they can still be separated, especially if this symbiote does it willingly, but you ripping it off is like ripping out someone's nervous system. It's not something that's fun. It's not easy. It's a very complicated and painful process. So he says, but Spider-Man's friends can't sever my other from me. Our bond is total now, because by this point, Eddie Brock had been with the symbiote longer than Spider-Man had been with it when he was bonded to it. Still, a memory haunts me. As we fell from the church tower, even as grasping for Spider-Man depleted its body and spelled our doom, I could not make my other stop, as if it cared for Spider-Man more than me. Again, this goes back to that was the symbiote's first real love. And again, not in a romantic sense, because the symbiotes reproduce asexually, but it was the first host it had formed a real connection with. It was more or less trying to start a life with him. Spider-Man was its home. But my other tells me this is foolish. It wants nothing for the best for me. It would never betray me, never hurt me, not for him. I choose to believe it. It's easier that way. Of course, that's the conclusion of the story. But again, it goes back to that Eddie has that sense of belonging, that sense of, I need to be accepted, I need to be embraced, to where even deep down, he knows that the symbiote loves Spider-Man more than it loves him. He ignores that fact just because he's so desperate for that attachment. And again, they're physically attached because they're bonded, but it's the just being accepted, just being embraced. He was rejected by his father. His mother died during childbirth. His sister saw him as nothing but a burden. Anytime he got attention from friends or girls or whatever, it was because it was through lies. It was through deception. Even when he became a success, it was through, deception. Well, granted, it was the guy he was interviewing that was lying, but Eddie just went with it. And of course, on the symbiote, it plays the part of, hey, you've been rejected. Nobody wants you. I'll accept you, though, because, they're both technically rebounds. Anyone who's going through that scenario, whether you were the rebound or you're picking somebody up on the rebound, whatever, it's very opportunistic, almost predatory in a way. I mean, not like, it's some creepy pervert, but it's seeing somebody in Eddie who's vulnerable mentally, emotionally, physically, and so it bonds with him when he comes into the church. And of course, the symbiote needs a host to survive. Symbiotes feed off of adrenaline, which is why in the old Spider-Man stories, whenever he was bonded to the symbiote, he would wake up and man, I'm tired. Why am I so tired? I had a full night's rest. Well, that's because the symbiote was taking his body late at night and swinging around and fighting crime or whatever. And so a lot of criminals, especially like his high-profile villains, were like, man, why is Spider-Man acting so weird? I'm right here. He's not talking. He's not joking. He's not making fun of me, which is something Spider-Man does to overcome fear or to hide the huge amount of fear he has for his villains. And he wasn't doing any of that. So it's very a character. It's because he was asleep and the symbiote was using his body, and it was doing this to force his adrenal gland to produce adrenaline that it would consume. And that's really when Spider-Man noticed that something was really wrong. He's like, man, ever since I got this suit, I'm just not getting enough sleep. And of course, Eddie having adrenal cancer at the time. Okay. Sorry about that. I had to use the bathroom. So I may be a bit off where I was saying. But anyways, you got that predatory nature of taking advantage of someone from the symbiote. And you see in later stories that, it's like, hey, you need me. You can't leave me. We have to be together. And of course, Eddie was suffering from adrenal cancer. And so it was the perfect food source for the symbiote because, hey, with this cancer, he's producing excess adrenaline anyways. It didn't have to wake him up or take his body late at night. It would always have extra food, which is why Eddie always had so much better rest than Peter did with the symbiote. And of course, from Eddie Brock's perspective, even if he didn't want to be with the symbiote anymore, he couldn't afford to leave it. He would die. His adrenal cancer would kill him. And so not only does the symbiote fulfill a emotional and psychological need, of course, because I'm being accepted, I'm being loved, I'm going to get revenge on Spider-Man for ruining my life. But now it's a medical necessity. And so this is essentially the perfect symbiosis. They both need each other, and they both have that mutual hatred for Spider-Man. But of course, there's always that doubt in Eddie's mind that the symbiote will always prefer Peter over him. And of course, the symbiote will deny these feelings. Oh, I don't want Spider-Man. He's awful. He's evil. Because even though it feels betrayed and abused by Spider-Man, and again, you see this in abusive relationships as well. Somebody will get abused emotionally, physically, even sexually, and that person will defend them no matter what. You see this with children and their parents. Kids that are neglected or abused by their parents. And it's like, oh no, I love my mom, I love my dad, they're so great. Even though someone who knows the situation on the outside will say, no, they're a horrible human being. What they're doing is not right. Or in regards to intimate relationships, marriages, spouses, whatnot. It's like, oh, you should leave them. They're treating you terribly. And of course, if you've been with someone long enough, I've been in both scenarios, in particular with an intimate relationship, you normalize it in your mind. It's like, oh no, they're, it's just nobody's perfect, and you gotta stick it out, and you gotta work through your problems, but never or rarely discovering that, hey, there's a line, and you do not cross it. And of course, so even though Spider-Man not coming from a place of evil, but from a place of self-preservation and survival, would try to get rid of the symbiote, whether or not it died or not. He didn't care. The symbiote still cared about him. Matter of fact, that's, again, as I've stated before, it drug him to safety before going down into the church, because it still loved him despite everything Spider-Man had done to it, despite the rejection, the hurt, physical and emotional. And so you get this complexity, this 3D aspect to the Venom character, not just with Eddie Brock, but with Venom as well. It's a theme that repeats through the Venom character. For one, throughout all the Venom stories, like all your old 90s run, which was really a series of miniseries, that's a whole nother can of worms in of itself, where, it's Eddie and Venom, even whenever they kind of get over their issue with Spider-Man, and they don't become friends, but they become civil. It's like, hey, let bygones be bygones. It's, Eddie and Venom against the world, we've got each other's backs, through hardship, through, come what may. And, through later stories, even with other hosts, when Venom and Eddie aren't together anymore, there's still this complex nature of, Venom. If you're a good person and you are a host of Venom, Venom will care about you. Now, because again, unless you're like a horrible person like MacDonald Gargan, I mean, with MacDonald Gargan, the Scorpion, Venom kind of became its most sinister, but that was really due to the influence that Gargan had on the symbiote. Because, yeah, the symbiote, through biochemistry, unintentionally will have an influence on the host's psychological and emotional state. But the host's personality, the host's psychology will have an effect on the symbiote as well. And just because Gargan was so insane, he was so crazy, it made Venom a monster essentially. But And so they're not bonded anymore, but the symbiote doesn't care for Garg. He's like, man, you are toxic, man. You are horrible. Lee Price was another symbiote. Nope. Get away from me. Another one was a short-lived host called Angelo Fortunato. Venom straight up abandoned him midair. He's like, man, you're a pussy. He's like, I have no time for you. But Eddie Brock, even to this day, of course, they're the newer Venom stories. It's become such a convoluted cosmic mess. But Eddie and Venom are still real cool. Venom and Spider-Man are real cool, even though Spider-Man's kind of like, I don't know about this. But even Spider-Man's kind of going over his issues with Venom at this point. But yeah, Venom Dark Origins, it's a great pickup. I would say it's a great read. It's real easy. It's like 4 or 5 chapters. It's not hard. I mean, you take an hour out of your day, not rushing, you'll get through it. It allows you to appreciate the Venom character more. It allows you to appreciate Eddie Brock. Because, traditionally the story is like, ooh, Venom's this evil thing, and ooh, Eddie Brock's a jerk, and Spider-Man's the good guy. But it takes it from the perspective of the villain, which Venom, be it the symbiote or Eddie Brock, they've never been a straight-up villain. Yeah, they've done some bad things. But even when they were, quote-unquote, hurting innocent people, it was almost like the Darth Vader effect when he killed the younglings. It was like, hey, they've already been corrupted by the Jedi. I'm just sparing them a worse fate. Venom and Eddie, because again, one was always influencing the other. It was a mutual thing. They were feeding into each other's delusions to where, hey, Spider-Man's the bad guy. I'm protecting the innocent. He's this awful jerk, And so, it's really Venom, the symbiote, and Eddie Brock have always been a tragic villain. They've done some bad things, but they're not in of themselves horrible entities. There's a story later on, to quote it, I think it was from Back in Black, but Eddie tells Peter, I'm sorry. Just because I've done bad things doesn't mean I'm a bad person. Because he never was. He was a jerk, he was a fraud, he was a phony. But much like Spider-Man around that same time, he was doing what he thought was right, what he thought was okay, or at the very least was okay. And it wasn't, it may have been selfish, unlike Spider-Man, but it wasn't malicious. It wasn't like, haha, I'm going to kill some people, and I'm going to take over the world, and I'm going to just do all these evil things. No, he just wanted to be loved. He wanted to be accepted. He wanted, just that attention. He wanted that validation that he just never got as a child. And of course, Venom, by the time they met up, had gone through a very similar experience, especially whenever you read later Venom stories like The First Host, to where Venom was just used. And so it had finally found a connection to Spider-Man, and it lost all that. So when Venom and Eddie Brock first met up and bonded, it's like, hey, we've recently been through some rough spots. We got each other's backs now. And so again, you had two entities, I'm just going to say two people who've been through, have just had a rough life, and, had recently lost everything after they found their footing. Venom lost Spider-Man, and Eddie Brock had lost his job, his reputation, his wife. When they finally got to the point to where they thought they were doing good, they lost it all. All because, they may have been, a bit naughty, but it wasn't malicious. Eddie was not being malicious when he was false reporting. The symbiote was not being malicious whenever it was using Spider-Man's body when he was trying to bond with him. There was no actual evil present there. Some darkness maybe, some anger, but not true evil. And so, like I said, it's Venom Dark Origin is a great story. You get a good background for Eddie Brock. Even though you may not agree with him or his actions, you do sympathize to a degree where he comes from. Because there's a lot of people, whether it's through relationships, life, work, whatever, who have walked a similar road to where, okay, yeah, you're doing the wrong thing and you shouldn't have been doing that, but you weren't a bad person. And it goes to show that, especially as children, because, a lot of people's problems start in childhood, that it makes a world of difference if a child has validation, if a child has acceptance, if a child has love. Eddie may not have, spouted out all these lies and all these falsehoods and been kind of a jerk if his father didn't blame him for his mother's death, if his father embraced him and gave him approval. Because we learn in other stories that no matter what Eddie did, whether it was sports or whatever, his father just didn't give him that feedback. His father didn't give him that attention. His father, was, he was, Charles Brock was very much the epitome of a lot of 20th century fathers in America. He was, well, I go to work, I pay the bills. That's my job as a dad. Don't need to do anything beyond that, which is something that I'm glad we are stepping away from as a society. I mean, yeah, paying bills and being responsible, it is important, don't get me wrong, but your child still needs that validation. They need that attention. They need that affection. Granted, discipline them too, but don't neglect their emotional, psychological needs. And unfortunately, that's what Eddie Brock went through. And you see that with a lot of girls too. Sometimes you see that with mothers. And then all it takes is that one person, that one Mr. Right, in this case, the symbiote, to come into that person's life, that child's life. Of course, Eddie was an adult by this point, but again, your childhood traumas and neglects carry out through your adolescence and your adulthood. That person comes into that life and like, hey, I'll give you what you want. I'll give you what you need. Forget everybody else. And of course, by that point, if you try to correct your child, it's already too late. This person's whispered in their ear. This person is filling the role you never did. Even if, sometimes this person does have good intentions. Sometimes this person is a straight up predator. But the child is not going to be amenable to reason at that point. As Spider-Man himself saw, he's like, Eddie, hey man, like, I'm not trying to do anything wrong. You're just not taking responsibility. But Eddie didn't want to hear to this point because he had the symbiote. The symbiote told him everything he wanted to hear. The symbiote validated his thoughts and feelings. And of course, it led him down to a very negative path. It led him down the path to violence. And oftentimes to murder, to all kinds of crimes. Even when he, in his later stories, when he's being more heroic and trying to save people, he's still going about it a bad way, because he has that validation from a bad source. Granted, the symbiote, again, in and of itself isn't evil, but if Eddie's father and his sister and things like that had given him that time and attention growing up, he may not have had that problem. The symbiote, while it's not a human being, if Spider-Man had studied it a bit further or whatever, and taken the time to really get to know it, because hey, this is a whole new experience, he may not have rebonded with it, but perhaps him and Mr. Fantastic could have found a more suitable host. And, the symbiote may not have turned into a malicious force that it later becomes. And like I said, it's an overall fantastic read. I highly recommend it. You can probably get it on Amazon, eBay, super cheap. Pick it up for pennies. If you go to your local comic book store and you see it in the used section, grab it instantly. It's great for your collection. And yeah, if you guys like what you hear, like the video, subscribe, and hell, give whatever support you can, because the more support you guys give, the more content I can put on this channel. Please, by all means, leave your thoughts, feelings, comments down in the comments below. If you like the content, if you hate the content, if you like the story, you've read it yourself, you have your own take on it. Personally, I think Venom is one of the best characters Marvel has going right now, because in the past 20 years, I mean, hell, Venom has had more character development than anybody else, and where everyone else just seems like it's just a bunch of repeat stories over and over again. And Marvel, aside from the Venom symbiote itself, hasn't really progressed their characters as people since the 1990s. I mean, yeah, Marvel has a slime timeline, and so they don't age their characters as fast. But God, man, it just feels like the same old stuff. But Venom constantly evolves. Venom constantly goes through change. And hopefully they reach an apex with Venom, give Venom a satisfying conclusion. I doubt they will, because it's Marvel Comics. But yeah, this book, great introductory piece, highly recommended. But yeah, like, share, subscribe, and stay tuned for more content. Later.